Hello again YouTube, and I've got another do-it-yourself video for you guys. In this one I'm going to be installing an oil cooler in my 370Z. If you guys find this video helpful, give it a thumbs up and even hit that subscribe button down below for more do-it-yourself videos. The first things first, we need to get the front of the car jacked up just high enough so that I can actually get underneath it to be able to work on the car. So let's get right to it. Now whenever I'm jacking my vehicles up, I do use a floor jack, and I do make sure to use it's called pinch weld adapter. It's basically just a rubber puck that you stick on top of the jack to be able to prevent the jack from damaging the pinch welds. The location that you're going to set this is going to be on the designated jack points. For this car, you will see these two grooves right here. That marks where you want to stick your jack so that you can safely jack the car up. So I'm just going to stick the jack underneath this point and proceed to jack the car. If you do not already have a floor jack, I highly recommend investing in one. These things only cost around $50 for a basic long standard unit. This makes jacking the car up a lot easier instead of having to use the scissor jacks that come with the car. The next thing you'll want to do is position your floor jack in place underneath the pinch weld, and I use yet another adapter for the jack stand to prevent any damage to the pinch weld. And then at this point you want to slowly let the jack down so that the car rests on top of the jack stand. Now we'll just go and repeat the same steps on the other side, making sure that we jack the car up to about the same height. And one thing I forgot to mention is you do want to make sure you set your parking brake. That's so that the car doesn't slide back on you. So that way it's nice and secure up in the air. And with the car safely jacked up in the air now, the next order of business is going to be to go ahead and pop the hood, and then we will disconnect the negative terminal of the battery. So the battery will be underneath this cover here in the back left corner of the engine bay. Just go ahead and pull the tabs open to be able to expose the battery. The negative terminals here on this side should be a 10mm socket. And with that loose, you want to tuck it away somewhere safely where it won't be at risk of moving up and making contact with the negative terminal again. So now that that's tucked out of the way, we can proceed to removing some of the under shrouds underneath the vehicle, as well as the front bumper. And in order to make it easier for you to take off the fender liner and be able to remove the front bumper, I am just going to go ahead and remove both of the front wheels. This isn't strictly necessary, but it will allow you to slide out from underneath the car a little easier while you're working underneath it. To clarify, you do need to remove the passenger side wheel like I'm doing now. You don't have to remove the driver's side wheel, but it will make accessing the bolt that holds the bumper on a lot easier. So now we're sitting underneath the car, and we are going to remove this plastic undershroud that covers the oil pan. To do that, you're going to take off a lot of these 10mm bolts that are lining the outside. I'm actually missing a couple of them. For some reason, mine weren't here when I got it from the dealership. And apart from those 10mm bolts, you will also have some of these little plastic clips in the center that you'll need to remove as well. There's about 3 of them, I think, here through the center. And then you should be able to take this plastic shroud off. And here's a better view of those plastic clips. You can just get underneath them from one side with a flathead if you want to, but if you have 2 flatheads, I'd recommend trying to go in from 2 sides at once. That'll prevent any damage to the clip, but you just need to pop this center piece out right here, and then you can pull the entire clip out. Alright, next thing I'm going to do is remove these little air shields here that are on both sides of the car. These sit in front of the tires. It looks like there's just 3 10mm bolts holding these on. You only have to remove this air guard from the passenger side, but if you remove it from the driver's side, it will make peeling the fender liner back easier later when we decide to take the bumper off. And with this air dam piece removed, I'll go ahead and also remove this remaining 10mm bolt and this little clip right here that's holding this bottom section to the fender. Once again, this bolt and clip are optional on the driver's side, but I would recommend going ahead and removing them. Now the instructions sent from Z1 do call for the entire passenger side fender liner to be removed, so we can start off by removing this plastic panel in the back here, which is held on by 3 clips. And then I believe I see 4 additional clips holding this fender liner on. There's 1 clip sitting here right next to the panel we just removed, 1 that's sitting up here, 1 that's connecting it to the other section of the fender, and then there's 1 sitting right over here. On the passenger side, you only need to remove this clip on the side, so that way you can peel the fender liner back so you can access the bolt that holds the bumper on. And this is what you'll see once you have removed that fender liner. The next thing you'll want to do is you'll want to remove this 10mm bolt that sits up top that connects to the bumper. So now the next thing that we are going to do is go ahead and remove this piece right here, this air dam deflector. There's just a bunch of little plastic clips, both on the bumper side and on the air dam side right here. You just need to undo all these, and then the air dam is supposed to be able to slide out from underneath the front bumper. So Z1's instructions tell you to go ahead and remove this piece before you take off the bumper, but I'm going to go ahead and do the reverse. I'm going to take the bumper off first because this thing is tightly wedged underneath the bumper here. So let's take the bumper off first, and then we should be able to remove that piece. Now right now the bumper is currently only going to be held on by clips, both on this side and right here underneath the headlights. So what you'll need to do is you'll need to pull firmly on both sides. You don't want to pull too hard, you're not trying to break the bumper, but just give it a firm tug directly out from the headlight, and then those clips should be able to pop off. I would recommend finding a second person to help you remove this bumper because it means you can have somebody on either side. When you do remove the bumper completely, it will still be held on to the car by the wires that go to the fog lights, so you don't want to let the weight of the bumper rest on those fog lights. You do want to kind of keep the bumper propped up as you remove the cables. And just to kind of show you guys what you're going to have to deal with these, they are attached just by a simple plug here. You just got to press down pretty firmly on the top there to be able to loosen it. And then it's held to the bumper by this guy. If you just pinch the sides here, these sides kind of dent in, and then you can pull that out of the bumper so that you free this cable. On the other side of the car here, you'll have this male plug, which will also detach in the same way. There's just a little tab here that you press on the top. And then that cable on the bumper is connected to the reservoir right here. You also just have to pinch the little nub on this side to be able to free the cable. Now hopefully this air dam should be able to come off a little easier now. There we go. That's now removed. Now, removing this center bar here is not strictly necessary in order to be able to install this oil cooler, but it will make the job a lot easier. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove it. It should just pull out like so. Set this aside. And then there will be, it looks like 4 bolts on both sides that we'll need to remove. Now would be a good time to go ahead and drain your oil. Just go up top to the engine and take off the oil filler cap, and then loosen the oil drain plug down below, and then go ahead and remove your oil filter as well. And while you're waiting on the oil to drain, it might be beneficial to go ahead and just start cleaning up the radiator here. Your Z's probably been to battle with quite a few insects in its time, so it might be useful to go ahead and just clean up the radiator while you're waiting on all that oil to drain. Alright, got the radiator about as clean as I'm going to get it today. Just ended up using a little toothbrush to kind of knock out some of the stuff that's sitting in there. Got out most of the big pieces. There's still some small stuff that's actually going to be sitting in between each of the teeth here that I can't really get to. But it's a lot cleaner than when I started. So it looks like the oil is just about finished draining now. So we will go ahead and put back in the oil drain plug. And I'll go ahead and seal off the top as well, just to make sure that nothing ends up falling into the oil pan. Alright, now that we got all of the panels removed off of the Z, it is time to actually start assembling the oil cooler core and the brackets. So we'll go ahead and grab the supplied hardware and the core itself. Go ahead and set the zip ties aside, won't really need those. So the first step is to get out this aluminum bracket here, and we need to go ahead and free up these small little brackets that are attached to it using an Allen wrench. Now with those two smaller brackets removed off of the larger aluminum bracket, we should now be able to go ahead and just attach this to the bottom of the core. According to Z1's instructions, this bracket is reversible. You can put it on either way because the core can be rotated when you actually fit it on the vehicle. So I'm going to go ahead and just get that lined up, and then go ahead and reattach the brackets using your Allen wrench. The installation instructions that I'm giving right now are specific to the Z1 oil cooler kit. If you go for a Mishimoto kit, the brackets may be slightly different, so make sure you consult the installation manual that they provide. This is what it should look like. You'll have the two rubber pieces sandwiching the plate coming off of the core. The gold piece is on the bottom there, which is threaded to receive the Allen wrench screws. Now with that lower aluminum bracket installed, the next piece we are going to install is this smaller upper bracket. The position of the smaller bracket relative to the bottom aluminum bracket is pretty important. With this bottom plate facing forward, you want to install the upper bracket sort of like that. And that is the upper bracket mounted with the 10mm bolts. Again, if the plate is facing this way, you want to make sure that this upper mount is facing the opposite direction and in the upper left corner. Alright, the next step is now to install these two little U-clips that Z1 supplies. I've already gone ahead and clipped those on. You just need to unthread the bolt that comes already assembled in them, and then they just kind of snap into place, like so. You don't want to push these clips all the way in, otherwise I found it's really difficult to be able to get the oil cooler bracket to line up correctly, so you just want to push them in far enough so you can thread a bolt. Now we should be able to temporarily position the core using the two bottom brackets that we just installed. Alright guys, so I've skipped a couple steps here with you, but I finally got the core lined up with those brackets that we placed in there. With those brackets, I wouldn't push them in all the way because they don't line up perfectly with this lower bracket for the core. So I would just kind of keep those loose, that way you can actually get these bolts lined up. Now I don't have these tightened down all the way because the next step is going to be that we're going to need to drill a hole in this center bracket here, so that way we can mount the core. So the next step is to go ahead and mark a spot to drill through this center core support for this upper bracket. So I'm going to locate the position where I want to drill, and I'm going to go ahead and make a little mark with this screwdriver. I'm going to go ahead and unbolt the core now and drill a pilot hole to see if I'm sitting in about the right place. Now, before you begin to drill, I would probably recommend putting something behind this support in order to prevent you from drilling straight through the radiator. It turns out that the box that this core comes in is just about the right size. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that there in order to prevent myself from damaging the radiator. I would highly recommend that you find something better than just cardboard to protect the radiator. Preferably if you can find like a piece of plywood, that'll work much better. The cardboard just barely protected my radiator from getting any damage, so I would find something sturdier. You want to start off by drilling a pilot hole and then checking to make sure the alignment is good. And then you want to drill a hole just large enough where that pilot hole is, so that way you can fit the bolt that's going to hold that upper mount. Alright, and you can see the hole I drilled is just about perfect there. Everything looks like it is lined up. So I should be able now to go ahead and fix the oil cooler in place. Now before we do permanently fix this onto the car, Z1 does recommend that we go ahead and fill the core with oil. In order to do that, we are going to go ahead and remove the two plugs that are sitting on top of the oil cooler. And it looks like they take right around a 21 millimeter to be able to remove these. And then Z1 says to install one of these loose fittings that come in the package at a time. They do say to go ahead and lubricate the side with the O-ring. I'm just going to dab it in a bit of the oil here. And then I'll go ahead and thread that side on. I think what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go ahead and secure this to the car first before I start filling it. That way I don't have to move this core around when it's already filled with oil. So here's the fresh container of oil that I'm going to be using. I'm just going with the same stuff I used in my previous oil change. I think my plan will be to use the turkey baster to try and drip some of the oil in there because I can't really position the funnel correctly to be able to fill that up. Plus I think this thing is only going to take a little less than like a liter of oil. So I think that'll be the plan. Alright, so the core is now filled up to capacity with oil. You guys might be able to see it in there, but I have filled it up just about as high as it'll go. Now I'm just going to go ahead and thread on the other fitting. Also, when you guys are installing the core, make sure you keep an eye on this AC line back here. You don't want to have the core touching that whenever you install it. You don't want this to end up clanging together because it might make a lot of noise and it could possibly damage the AC line. So make sure you have plenty of clearance back here when you're installing. Okay, now it's time to start running the stainless steel lines. You will notice that one side is a little bit longer by about 6 inches or so. That's going to be important to remember when you're threading these on. So I'm going to go ahead and just feed these behind the center brace here. And then the shorter hose is going to be attached to this line, and the longer hose is going to be attached to this side here. Now before I attach the hoses, I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of thread sealant on these fittings because I have heard from some people that sometimes oil can leak, especially when it's getting hot. So I'm going to go ahead and clean off these threads a little bit, and then I'm going to apply some thread sealer. Alright, so those are the fittings now in place and tightened down. Originally I ran this line in front of the center beam here, but I was able to unbolt it and then rerun it behind here. So now both of the lines run behind the center beam. Now we need to route these lines all the way around and then underneath the windshield wiper bottle there. The only problem is this piece gets in the way, so we are going to need to trim this up. Just have some heavy duty scissors here that should do the trick. We're just going to cut it right along here. Okay, so that's that front piece removed now, so we can run the lines in front of it and then through this space here with the windshield wiper reservoir. So I've gone ahead and reinstalled this structural piece here, and I've gone ahead and run the lines over it just to make sure that they clear. And they do pass snugly just above the windshield wiper fluid reservoir. Now the next order of business is going to be to get these lines to run between the steering fluid lines right here. So there's a spacer that Z1 provides that's going to replace the bolt that sits just back there. So I'm going to need to back these lines out. Go ahead and unbolt this line and pull it forward about 1 inch, so that way we can run these lines in between here and then pass through this space into the oil filter. When unbolting this bracket so that you can reposition the steering fluid lines, you want to make sure that you do not bend the lines by accident because you could damage them. You also want to make sure when you reposition them that they're not rubbing against anything because they could possibly get damaged. So I had to put my camera back on the charger. It's about 30 minutes to an hour later now, but I finally got these lines run correctly. So as you guys saw, they do run, of course, above the windshield wiper fluid reservoir here. Now, here I had to deviate from the instructions a little bit. They tell you to run the oil cooler lines behind the bracket here once you've put in this 1-inch spacer that you can see back there. However, I could not get the oil cooler lines to bend to be able to actually make it around this bracket. So instead, I just have it passing behind this steering fluid line here, but in front of the bracket, and then it just passes through this gap here in the frame. One important thing when you're routing these guys is try not to bend them too much while you're trying to wrap them into place because you don't want to fray the protective covering on it. So when you're trying to get these through here, just make sure you're not putting too much stress on the lines, and definitely don't put too much stress on the steering fluid lines as well. You don't want these to burst and then end up leaking a lot of fluid everywhere. And then this right here is probably the hardest part. It is very difficult to try and get these 90-degree joints to be able to bend to reach the sandwich plate and to be able to orient the sandwich plate to get it in the right position because you don't want it to rub against the frame back here and you just barely have enough line to be able to actually make these connections. But I've finally got them set. These fittings are almost facing straight down. They are pushed slightly off towards the frame here, but I just managed to get them to fit. And I have just barely left enough room in here to be able to squeeze an oil filter up into the space, like so. So it is pretty tight, and then I believe this right here is an AC line. That basically sits against the oil filter, which I'm not entirely sure is going to be an issue or not. But I figured there's probably enough insulation on the back here. Hopefully this thing doesn't get too hot and doesn't mess with the refrigeration. But I ran my oil cooler lines underneath that, but everything is loosely in place now. I'm going to go ahead and apply my thread sealant to the threads here in order to prevent any leaks, and then I'll be able to tighten everything down correctly. A helpful hint when you're trying to position the sandwich plate, you want the fittings to be facing in about the 7 o'clock position when you're looking at the sandwich plate from this direction. You don't want them to be pointed straight down because then they could bump against the undershroud, but you also don't want them pointing too far towards the back of the car, otherwise these oil lines could bump against the cross member here, and that could end up damaging the lines and spewing oil everywhere. So you want to make sure that these oil lines have enough clearance. And in order to address the fitment issue with the oil filter and the AC line, I'm probably going to do an oil filter relocation sometime in the future, so that way they're not bumping up against each other. Right, now I've got these fittings tightened completely down. I just need to go and tighten the center fitting here. And while you're tightening the center bolt and the sandwich plate, I would probably recommend wedging something between the oil lines and the cross member back here, so that way the sandwich plate doesn't move, so your oil lines still have plenty of clearance. Now the next step is going to be to go ahead and fill up the car with oil, and then crank the engine to make sure that we're not getting any leaks. Alright, so the engine is now filled up with oil. It is currently sitting directly between the low and high mark, which is probably not exactly where you'll want it. You'll want it to be sitting right at the high mark because when the thermostatic plate decides to open up, it's going to drain some of that oil into the lines, and that's going to lower the oil level. So just make sure you fill it up to the high mark. Now that the engine is filled with oil, we'll go ahead and crank the engine and then check for leaks. So as you guys saw, it looks like we don't have any leaks, so we should be pretty much good to go. Only problem is we haven't tested the fittings that run to the oil cooler. Those unfortunately won't be able to see any oil until the engine gets hot enough to be able to open up that thermostatic plate. But just keep an eye on your guys' oil level. As I said, you do want to make sure you fill it up to the high mark because you will lose some of that when the oil cooler lines start to feed oil to the oil cooler. But keep an eye on your oil level when you guys are moving on. Also make sure that anywhere where the lines touch the body of the car, you have some sort of protective wrapping on it. I ended up just paying an additional $40 for Z1 to have that wrapped for me, so my lines are all protected now. They shouldn't see any fraying or damage from touching the body. But other than that, that's really all there is to installing the oil cooler. Just make sure you keep an eye on the oil level, as I said. If you guys have any questions on the install video, leave a comment down below and I'll make sure to get back to you. At this point, all there is left to do is reinstall all the things that we took off the car here, and then I've got quite a lot of cleaning to do in the garage right now. But thank you guys for watching, and I will see y'all in the next video. Later.